problems of fragility and conflict and development problems have become impossible to treat separately today.
Welcome to VoxDevTalks. My name is Tim Phillips. With record levels of armed conflict around the world in recent years, the study of conflict has gone from being a niche corner of economics into a thriving discipline that learns from and interacts with development economics. Rigorous empirical research on conflict is, however, relatively recent. Now, on VoxDevTalks, we have previously covered some of the work of the Reducing Conflict and Improving Performance in the Economy Recipe program, which aims to provide a better understanding of the links between conflict, economic growth, and public policies. And recently, I caught up with Dominic Rohner of the Geneva Graduate Institute. He's the research director of the program, and Oliver Vanden Eynde of the Paris School of Economics, who's the head of engagement of Recipe. They are two researchers who are helping to fill those gaps in our understanding, and they have just published new research that attempts to link the attributes of countries to the likelihood of different types of conflict arising in them. I spoke to them about this research, why it's an example of how economic methods can advance our knowledge of conflict and the policies to reduce it, and what the work of Recipe and the researchers who contribute to it can do to help economists everywhere influence policy on conflict and development. Dominic, hello.
Hello, Tim.
And welcome, Oliver, as well.
Hello, Tim.
In your research, Variants of Violence, you're trying to understand how different types of country experience conflict differently. Why do we need to think about it this way? Why do we need a classification?
There have been two approaches. One approach is like the big N approach, where you put all countries in the same bin, you compare apples and oranges, and you don't care that much about heterogeneity, and you try to come up with a general message, which is very useful as a starting point. It gives you a big picture, survey, synthesis of the problem you're looking at. But of course, all details and subtleties will be gone. And often economists have chosen this slightly superficial approach, if you like. Then the other approach, which have often been championed by other disciplines, have been approaches by country specialists, case studies, and also increasingly economists in recent years very often have done within country studies, which is much more precise, of course, and where we can often be much more confident in terms of causality rather than just pure correlation. However, the problem is, of course, that if I study something for Somalia, it may or it may not apply for Sudan and for Egypt. And that's exactly the problem, is we cannot stop with big N studies, but we cannot afford to do 200 studies separately, studies for each country. And so by having a typology, a classification of countries and conflicts that are similar, we are able to do better in terms of external validity and of generalizing the knowledge we get from individual studies.
But to get to a classification that's somewhere between big N and little n, you need more than one and less than 200 categories. How many buckets of countries are useful?
So I think you're absolutely right. And in our analysis, we ended up with 8 categories, which we construct by identifying 3 dimensions. And we have like a binary classification in each dimension. So that leaves us with 8 types of countries in our approach.
Which dimensions did you pick, and why did you pick just 3 dimensions? I imagine there's many dimensions you could have considered.
There could be indeed a virtually infinite number of dimensions you could pick. There are some dimensions that are quite easy to pick. I think it's quite non-controversial that income plays a big role. No matter which study you take, very often you see that civil wars are very often clustered in poorer countries, right? And so if you look at income shocks or even just country comparisons, income clearly is one of the really big determinants of conflict. Then there is also increasing evidence now that institutions, democracy, inclusiveness, that these are important factors. There is a growing literature on that. And a third dimension that is also where you have several studies showing the importance of it is about state capacity and security guarantees. What's kind of good about these three dimensions is that they are also policy relevant because income can be changed through public policies. You can do institution buildings, you can change inclusiveness, democracy, and you can invest in state capacity, as shown, for example, by the great work of Tim Besley and Thorsten Persson. In that sense, we picked dimensions that are important and have been shown by dozens and dozens of studies, but at the same time that are also policy relevant. We could have taken various other dimensions, but for the sake of being parsimonious and also for the sake of being policy relevant, we did choose to focus on these three.
You then have to decide which countries are high or low on each dimension. So what data can you use to do that? And can you give me some example of who ends up in which category?
So very important in our approach is that we didn't want to choose on a case-by-case basis. And we wanted to use like a purely data-driven approach where we take existing measures of each of these three dimensions and we then try to classify countries in high or low. So for income, we use GDP per capita. For democracy, we use standard democracy indices. And for state capacity, we use a measure of security that captures both the effectiveness of the security apparatus, but also the trust of the population in the security apparatus. Of those three measures, it's probably the security one that's hardest to measure, which is why in the paper, actually, we do quite some robustness to alternative measures of state capacity that are a bit broader, that capture perhaps also like administrative strength, etc. But just to give you a few examples, if we think about at the bottom, countries that are poor, non-democratic and non-secure. And so that's where you would find Sudan, Yemen, Uganda. If you move then to poor, non-democratic and secure, this would include countries like Rwanda, Morocco, Tanzania. It's important that when we do this classification exercise, we do our classification for a baseline period, which in our case is around 2007. And I think already in the examples you gave, you'll see that, some countries may have moved in the meantime, right? But we are interested in kind of a historical classification that we can then look at to think about the conflict incidents in the last 15 years or so. Countries that would be poor, democratic and non-secure. So those would include in our data Kenya, Sri Lanka, countries that are rich, non-democratic and secure. These would be Gabon. As you would imagine, if you move all the way up, you would have countries that are rich, democratic and secure. And that's where we find UK, France, Switzerland, US.
Now you've got these 8 categories. The idea is to look at the quantity and the quality of the conflict that each category experiences. How does that vary in quantity by category?
In the paper that we have written together with Emma Verhill, by the way, the first thing we look at is, do we really see important differences? And what you see is that in most countries that are poor, non-democratic and non-secure, they have had conflict in the last few decades. So the vast majority of them. And then the intermediate categories, you have less conflict, of course. And then the most peaceful are situations, of course, unsurprisingly, by democratic, secure and rich countries. But what is, of course, interesting is to compare the different shades of gray. One thing that we found very striking was that if you start from a country that is poor, non-democratic and non-secure, and you just increase security, you will not that much reduce the level of fighting. The type of fighting will change, and that is very interesting.
I see. So there is a distinction, very much a distinction on the type of conflict that these different categories are existing. What is that? How does that change?
Among countries that are poor, non-democratic and non-secure, we see that the main type of violence is of the rebellion type, where the state is confronting an armed group. And as Dominic mentioned, as soon as you improve the security dimension, we see that the dominant type of violence becomes much more of the repression type, where there's one-sided violence by the state against civilians. As we move to countries that score well in all 3 dimensions, there the dominant type of violence becomes terrorism. And so that's a pattern that's very striking. I think there's one small thing I wanted to add as well about the quantity, which is that the incidence of violence in these different categories. What is striking as well is that improving one dimension always reduces conflict risk, but it's always useful to have improvements in other dimensions as well. So it's not just that if you improve just democracy or if you improve just income or just security, that you're already at this lowest incidence of conflict level. You really need improvements in all three dimensions to get to the lowest conflict risk statistics.
Okay, now you write in the paper that one-size-fits-all peace-building approaches may backfire. And what I thought when I read that is there currently a one-size-fits-all approach to peace-building? Is that how peace-building is done?
Well, I guess we're rather in the contrary world when there are too many sizes, in a sense, because economists have, well, how shall I put it politely? So economists follow incentives. Economists like to publish, to get tenure, to get into top 5 journals, etc. And so economists, they have maybe in the last few decades not given enough thought and interest in actual policy heterogeneity. So economists would have either focused on really big picture projects or then on very tight identification for very small cases. And also in other disciplines, you have a bit this tendency of having country specialists who know a lot about one country, incredible knowledge, but this leads to kind of a piecemeal approach where sometimes even spillovers from one country to another are not taken into account. If you put in place a new policy in Mali, well, this may affect other countries in the Sahel region. And so in some sense, you want to have something a bit in between. So neither one size fits all nor 200 sizes. And that's what we hope to champion with this typology approach.
Let me ask the question in a slightly different way. Can you give me examples of a peace-building policy strategy that would work in one country, but you've got a country in a different category? It's not going to work at all there.
There's actually plenty of examples that would work here. One of them is cash transfers. Among development economists, cash transfers are generally viewed as one of the most effective ways of reducing poverty. And there has been quite a lot of work evaluating these type of transfers as well in conflict settings and asking the question, like, do these policies help to reduce conflict? And so interestingly, in this literature, the results go in different directions. And this is actually, like, Dominic has written a great paper focusing on Niger, where he finds actually that cash transfers backfire. There's work as well by Ben Cross and others on the Philippines, where they find actually that cash transfers help to reduce conflict. And this may just be speculating, but one way to think about these differences is that the security environment, which is one of our dimensions, could play a very important role in whether these cash transfers are successful or not. Because if you have low security, which is definitely the case of Niger, what may end up happening is that the transfers fall in the wrong hands, so that you end up essentially subsidizing armed groups directly. Or in other contexts, these type of states interventions may actually put pressure on the local population. So I've done quite a lot of work myself on the targeting of civilians in conflicts. And in many asymmetric conflicts, civilians are targeted because they're suspected of collaborating with the government. So if you then come in as a government in a low security environment and you give certain benefits to the local population, there is a risk that the rebels will oppose this and will put pressure on the population to prevent them from working with the government. Whether this mechanism is powerful or not will depend on contextual factors like the security environment. Another example would be mining royalties. So there's a very strong logic and intuition that giving stakes in mining activities to local communities might be helpful in reducing the conflict that's potentially generated by natural resource extraction. At the same time, we know that such royalties, they generate local economic rents, which can actually attract armed groups, which can become drivers of conflict themselves. If we have a policy where we try to make local communities benefit more from natural resource extraction, then the institutional environment may be extremely important. Because if this happens in a context where institutions are not inclusive, it's probably much more likely that this strategy actually locally exacerbates conflict rather than reducing it, because it concentrates strong economic trends in a certain locality, which are more easily appropriable by armed groups. These are just two examples linked to like Dominic's research and some of my own research. But I think in any area of conflict research, you can think about like heterogeneity and how our classification may help. Like it's not the only possible classification, and it definitely doesn't cover all relevant dimensions. But I think in quite a few cases, it actually helps to interpret some of the conflicting evidence that has been generated in micro studies.
Let's talk a little bit about how this might help move the research forward. I mean, one of the stated goals for the recipe program is to fill the gaps in our knowledge. Is this exercise helping to, in the first place, identify where those gaps are?
Some of the surprising findings that we had in this paper, I think, will be helpful for future work. So one thing, for example, I already hinted a bit at that, was that if, for example, you start out from a country that is non-secure, poor and non-democratic, and the only dimension you improve is security. And that's also what, Oliver was saying before in terms of complementarities. If you only do that, what we saw quite shockingly was that overall level of conflict doesn't go down that much, but we end up with different type of conflict. Namely, we have less rebellion or warlordism, but more state repression. So if you just make a state stronger without making it more accountable and more inclusive, the thing may backfire, because it may lead to the kind of nasty state that does purges and represses its own people. And so in that sense, this kind of interaction between security questions and between democracy questions are understudied. And more general, the paper is the first paper of a special issue in economic policy in this excellent academic journal. And the other papers, they're all focusing on particular themes. Mm-hmm. So we have 9 different themes. And what we see there, they all provide state-of-the-art surveys, synthesis of where these themes are, themes like climate change, gender, questions on public policies, etc. And we learn about where they stand, these themes, and we learn especially about the gaps and shortcomings. So one of the key contributions of this special issue is really to guide future generations of scholars towards the areas where the need for additional knowledge is most severe.
When you look at the list of economists who are doing conflict research at the moment, it's such an important area. Conflict is so visible, salient. Some people might be thinking, why do these gaps in our knowledge still exist?
It relates a bit to what Dominic mentioned earlier about the nature of the field or the different disciplines studying conflict. So economists studying conflict is a relatively recent phenomenon. Like until 2004 or so, This was clearly considered as a topic that belonged in some sense to political science. In the last 20 years, economists have included this in their analysis. I think also based on the observation that a lot of development problems are impossible to dissociate from issues of fragility. So clearly conflict is a core development challenge, and that makes it naturally relevant and interesting for economists. I think at the same time also the methods of economists have been adopted more and more by political scientists. And so the state of the field now is actually one where quantitative political scientists and economists use similar methods, ask similar questions, cite each other quite well in spite of existing disciplinary barriers. But this is really an interdisciplinary field, but one that's relatively young, like everything considered. The conflict research, as it's published in the top papers in economics, is not past its peak. It's still increasing, I think, every year. Naturally, with the development of a new, call it subdiscipline, there is a natural process where initially there are lots of papers trying to get at like grand patterns, the one size fits all that we mentioned earlier. And then there has been kind of a counter movement of lots of micro studies that are well identified. But it's really in this intermediate space where there's a remaining gap now, where we try to bring evidence from micro studies together. We try to identify areas that have not been covered, partly because sometimes data availability also really drives what people work on. Sometimes a lot of research is also motivated by the fact that the question has already been studied before. And so people are trying to critique question that is well established in some sense, overlooking potentially other gaps. So to me, this is really linked to the fact that this is a relatively recent literature, which has not seen a lot of coordinated attempts to push the agenda forward. And I think that's actually one of the great things about the recipe program. I think it's actually one of the first of such attempts of really trying to take stock and point out where remaining gaps are situated.
Yeah, I just wanted to also second what Oliver was saying on the greatness of the recipe program. One thing that's really remarkable about our program is that it's interdisciplinary to its core. We have various political scientists on board as well. And we economists sometimes had the tendency to reinvent the wheel, while of course some of our obsession with causal identification can also maybe helpful in some settings beyond economics. So multiple disciplines working together is really excellent news for all of them. And Recipe is very, very committed to this interdisciplinarity.
And do you have the empirical sources, the data that you need at this point?
There are many great data sets around, most of them, if almost all of them, actually created by political scientists. So we are in a situation where economists kind of piggyback and free ride on political scientists when it comes to data. So we now have these data sets that are very detailed events data at the level of a given location. We know the longitude and the latitude. We know the day when it takes place. We know the details about an event, the groups involved. And these data sets like ACLED or UCDP, GED, they have enabled this empirical revolution and progress over the last dozen years. The problem is that, of course, there are still many, many gaps. And one of our goals in the Recipe program is helping to close gaps in data coverage. For example, today we talked about questions of criminal justice. Data on that is very lacunary. Or there are data on a variety of counterinsurgency topics where we don't know much. So I think there is a big need for additional data collection.
Some integrated data sources that are used a lot in research on conflict, like ACLED, UCDP, those sources are great, but they also have limitations in that the raw source of data is often press reports of some type. And so these data, they may have certain biases, and for some types of conflict, they may not be the right data to use. So, there's scope for better data on conflict, but there's also potentially even more scope for better data during conflicts, because conflict often affects the production of economic data, and the survey data that economists typically have access to in any setting may not exist exactly during conflicts. But they are crucial to understand how the conflict affects households, how the conflict affects firms. And in that sense, there's a lot of scope as well to improve the data that we have available for our research.
Going back to those dimensions, so for example, on the rich-poor dimension, then what do we know about how investment or public policy to grow the economy, how that affects conflict risk?
There's a relatively strong consensus in the literature that there exists something that we call the opportunity cost channel as a driver or a mechanism generating conflict. The idea there is that if people are poor, if their livelihoods are threatened, they're going to be more likely to end up in armed groups, and this will generate more violence. It's a very reduced form mechanism, but it's one of the workhorse kind of models or ideas in the economic analysis of conflict. And so if you take this mechanism seriously, then immediately you should conclude that any public policy that improves livelihoods should actually help to reduce conflict. Mm-hmm. And there has been quite a lot of research evaluating specific policies. So I've talked about cash transfers before. For cash transfers, for example, the results are conflicting. There are a lot of question marks about what are these contextual factors that make same policy essentially work in one context and not in another. There are other areas where research is more lacking. So education is, for example, one of them. For many of these examples, Dominic is the one who is responsible for the exception because he has actually researched the effect of education investment on conflict, but it's a topic that generally has not received a lot of attention. And then in terms of investment, I think that there the stylized fact is mostly one of heterogeneity. It really seems to depend on the type of investment. Investments in natural resources tend to spur conflict. This is something I think we know, or in which there's quite a lot of consensus, but we don't know much about which policies can actually mitigate these impacts, because I think most economists recognize the potential of this investment in improving livelihoods as well, but we don't have the right policies that allow us to make these investments effective in such a way that they don't increase conflict risk at the same time.
Other questions, for example, gaps that also Oliver and I have been talking about with other people were on questions on infrastructure. We don't know much about public policies. We don't know much about private investment with firms. We're in a world where the Security Council is blocked by competing superpowers. And democracy scores worldwide are, if anything, on the decline, have been now for a dozen years. And if it's harder to just rely on superpowers doing the right thing, then we may need to rely on other champions. And so far, the track record of the private sector has been a bit dismal. So there are some papers, one of them called This Mine is Mine, where we find that mining fuels conflict, but if mining firms behave well in terms of good corporate social responsibility, this risk can be alleviated. And Tommaso Sonno has also done work in a recent article in the Economic Journal, where Tommaso finds that multinationals sometimes fuel conflict if they engage in agriculture-intensive activities that really land-intensive and that crowd out traditional occupations by the local population. So often multinationals have not been in the right team for peace, but we cannot afford to have this situation, given that we cannot just rely on superpowers working together hand in hand. We need the help from the private sector and from firms, and we need to find ways to have the private sector and the economy as rather a friend than as a foe in our goal to solve grand challenges like conflict.
Your analysis really makes a point about how important strong institutions are. There's been a lot of work on institutional economics and the value of that, and not least because 3 people won the Nobel Prize for it last year. It's still, however, quite controversial, and that empirical work is hard to do. Is it still a challenge to be able to do good empirical work on the value of institutions?
I think I may take a small step back from this question to situate a bit the research that we do with respect to different sets of Nobel Prize winners, actually. If you think about Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, they really look at very long-term effects of institutions, which makes it by its very nature, it's very hard to measure the underlying mechanisms. And I think that's partly what makes this work almost inherently contentious, even if I think that the frameworks that they provide, they've really had a huge impact on our discipline, and they've put these questions at the core of the economic debate, which is, of course, extremely important. Another set of Nobel Prize winners who are active in this sphere would be Abhijit Banerjee and Nestor Duflo. And so they say that they take an approach to development economics, which is the one of a plumber, right? They try to understand the pipes and which small interventions work. I think if we're studying conflict, we would situate ourselves somewhere in between, because for institutional questions, the interventions that we do, it's rare that they are so micro level that you can actually run an RCT to evaluate its impact. So you're often interested in a level of government that's too high to do a fully controlled evaluation. But we want this research to be policy relevant directly. And so we're also not in the world where we're just thinking about very long-term impacts where the policy implications are not entirely obvious. So what is left and what can we still study? Well, actually, there's quite a lot of changes in institutions that are feasible for policymakers and that can be evaluated. So those would include, for example, rules about representation. So Dominic has done some work about the representation of different religious groups in Northern Ireland and how this helped to reduce conflict. Other institutional interventions could be thinking about mining royalties, how exactly in a state which has different levels of government, which levels of government benefit from certain types of economic activity. That is part of the institutional design as well. And it's something that can be changed, but that also, perhaps not in an RCT, but at least in a natural experiment that can be evaluated in certain contexts. And that's exactly where the core of recipe is situated. So we take institutions very seriously, but we try to think about interventions and changes that are actually relevant for policy.
We are at a moment where rival powers are using trade and sanctions and aids as a way to gain advantage in conflict. We've seen this in the emerging research on geoeconomics, and we are very aware of the conflicts in many places around the world and the political forces that are sustaining it. Dominic, you mentioned at the beginning that the important thing about this is very policy relevant, but does your experience in working with policymakers suggest that economists can actually influence these geopolitical forces at the moment?
It is at least my goal. So it may be hard to achieve to really have an impact, but last time we met, we were talking about my book, The Peace Formula.
Yes.
And the reason I wrote it was exactly in the goal to potentially make a difference. It's of course not easy to make a difference. One of the reasons why VoxDev is so important is this translation of scientific knowledge into understandable language. Populists, they don't provide good solutions. Populists often are good at sensing what the problems are. Often the solutions they find are cynical, bad solutions that backfire. So populists are much better at seeing what people are worried about than about actually providing good solutions. And it's true that the mode of communication with social media, etc., helps them. The fact that people's attention span is like a short of 10 seconds means that it's, of course, easier to just make some wrong statement than to explain a deep, complex scientific phenomenon. So the cards are a bit stacked against us, against science in some sense. But it is also important that we improve our skills of communication. And many scientists have too much focused on their scientific career, which unfortunately often doesn't reward policy impact and rewards just publications. And at the same time, they haven't shown enough interest into making a policy difference. And sometimes all of us, we are way too nerdy. We can improve and we must improve. Part of what Recipe is about is exactly that. So we have already run online lecture series where we all SEAM leaders, we volunteered to do that. We were super happy to do it. We had in some sessions several hundred people attending, people from all over the world. So we tracked where they come from, virtually every continent, many countries where people connected from. And so that's really important because we can, in this way, get a direct channel of communication with people around the world. And it is true that small changes can make a huge difference. Let me give you two examples. Take Switzerland. It was the most violent corner of Europe during the whole medieval ages, right? Catholics and Protestants killing each other in a string of different conflicts. One of the main exports of Switzerland were mercenaries who fought in every war on the continent. And then in 1847, there was the big secession war, the Sonderbundskrieg, where basically after the victory of the Protestant liberal forces, they created a new constitution with solid power-sharing democratic institutions. And Switzerland went from one of the most unstable, poorest corners of the continent to one of the richest and more peaceful and most stable places in Europe, with relatively simple reforms: direct democracy, bicameral system, proportional representation, grand coalition, power-sharing government, and the thing worked. And if you look at the troubles in Northern Ireland, that also lasted for decades and decades, with the Good Friday Agreement, that was a complete game changer, and violence went down big time. And so there is hope. By making the right political choices, we can make a real difference. And so it is very much worthwhile fighting for that.
Dominic, in his answer, has focused a lot on a level that is crucial, which is the level of national politics and the role also of individual citizens in trying to shape those policy choices. From a slightly different perspective, and within Recipe, I happen to be responsible for outreach effort, which means that I've interacted a lot with policy makers, mostly in international organizations. What has struck me in those conversations is that there's strong demand for exactly this type of research. And that is linked to what I mentioned earlier, which is that problems of fragility and conflict and development problems have become impossible to treat separately today. And so that means that even corners of, say, the World Bank, who are focused on what you might think of as a purely economic problem, like firm development, nowadays they're really interested about how firm development interacts with conflict. How do you do firm development in fragile environments? That to me suggests that there's actually a lot of scope for researchers to contribute to debates. Unfortunately, aid budgets are under extreme pressure, which also means that trade-offs will become more and more salient between different ways of spending aid money. And I think that, if anything, increases the relevance and importance of the work that we do in Recipe.
There's a lot of work to do. Good luck with doing it. Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you.
And Dominic as well.
Thank you very much.
First of all, I should tell you about that paper. It is called Variants of Violence, Classifying Conflict Types and Policies for Peace. It's currently open access online at Economic Policy, with imminent publication in the special issue that we were talking about. The authors, Dominic Rohner, Oliver Vanden, and Emma Verheele. We also mentioned Dominic's book called The Peace Formula that was published by Cambridge University Press in August 2024. It was also around that time the subject of a special episode of VoxDevTalks. Also, let's mention the flagship conference on global sustainability. That's taking place at the Geneva Graduate Institute on the 1st of October 2025. It's co-organised by the Hoffman Centre for Global Sustainability, the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and Recipe. And it's got 3 strands: climate and nature, peace and conflict, and interdisciplinary approaches. This has been a VoxDevTalk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe on your podcast platform. You will find us wherever you get your podcasts. When you do, you will be able to find all our other episodes about conflict, and especially those on the work of Recipe. All our past episodes are also at VoxDev.org. And if you like what you're hearing, please tell someone else about us and leave us a review as well. VoxDevTalks is a Talk Normal production. The assistant producer is Megan Bieber and our editor is Andrei Zargarian. Thanks to Oliver Haney and Iman Siddiq at VoxDev.